Chapter 11 of Old-Fashioned Fairy Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Joshua Jones. Old-Fashioned Fairy Tales by Juliana Horatia Gatty Ewing. Chapter 11. Murdoch's Wrath. There was not a nicer boy in all of Ireland than Pat, and clever at his trade too, if only he had one. But from his cradle he learned nothing, small blame to him, with no one to teach him. So when he came to years of discretion, he earned his living by running messages for his neighbours, and Pat could always be trusted to make the best of a bad bargain and bring back all the change, for he was the soul of honesty and good nature. It's no wonder that he was beloved by everyone, and got as much work as he could do, and if the pay had but fitted the work, he'd have been mighty comfortable, but as it was, what he got wouldn't have kept him in shoe leather, but for making both ends meet by wearing his shoes in his pocket, except when he was in town and obliged to look genteel for the credit of the place he came from. Well, all was going on as peaceable as could be till one market day, when business, or it may have been pleasure, detained him to the heel of evening, and by nightfall, when he began to make the road short in good earnest, he was so flustered rehearsing his messages to make sure he'd forgotten nothing, that he never bethought him to leave off his brogues, but tramped on, just as if shoe leather were made to be knocked to bits on the king's highway. And this was what he was after saying: "A dozen hanks of grey yarn for Mistress Murphy, 3 gross of bright buttons for the tailor, half an ounce of throat drops for Father Andrew, and an ounce of snuff for his housekeeper," and so on. But these were what he went to the town to fetch, and he was afraid lest one of the lot might have slipped his memory. Now everybody knows that there are 2 ways home from the town, and that's not meaning the right way and the wrong way, which my grandmother, rest her soul, said there was to every place, but one that it's not genteel to name. There could only be a wrong way there, she said. The 2 ways home from town were the highway and the way by Murdoch's Rath. Murdoch's Rath was a pleasant enough spot in the daytime, but not many persons cared to go by it when the sun was down, and in years Pat was going backwards and forwards. He never once came home except by the high road till this unlucky evening, when just at the place where the 2 roads part, he got, as one may say, in a sort of confusion. "Halt," says he to himself, for his own uncle had been a soldier, and Pat knew the word of command. "The left-hand turn is the right one," says he, and he was going down the high road as straight as he could go, when suddenly he bethought himself. "And what am I doing?" says he. "This it was my left hand going to town, and how in the name of fortune could it be my left hand going back, considering that I've turned around? It's well that I looked into it in time." And with that he went off as fast down the other road as he started down this. But how far he walked he could never tell, before all of a sudden the moon shone out as bright as day, and Pat found himself in Murdoch's Rath. And this was the smallest of the wonder, for the Rath was full of fairies. When Pat got in, they were dancing round and round till his feet tingled to look at him, being a good dancer himself, and as he sat on the side of the Rath and snapped his fingers to mark the time, the dancing stopped, and a little man comes up in a black hat and a green coat, with white stockings and red shoes on his feet. "Won't you take a turn with us, Pat?" says he, bowing till he nearly touched the ground, and indeed he had not far to go, for he was barely 2 feet high. "Don't say it twice, sir," says Pat. "It's meself will be proud to foot the floor with ye." And before you could look round, there was Pat in the circle, dancing away for bare life. At first his feet felt like feathers for lightness, and it seemed as if he could have gone on forever. But at last he grew tired, and would have liked to stop, but the fairies would not, and so they danced on and on. Pat tried to think of something good to say, that he might free himself from the spell, but all he could think was, "A dozen hanks of grey yarn for Mrs. Murphy, 3 gross of bright buttons for the tailor, half an ounce of throat drops for Father Andrew, and an ounce of snuff for his housekeeper," and so on. And it seemed to Pat that the moon was on the one side of the Rath when they began to dance, and on the other side when they left off. But he could not be sure after all that going round. One thing was plain enough: he danced every bit of leather off the soles of his feet, and they were blistered so that he could hardly stand, but all the little folk did was stand and hold their sides with laughing at him. At last the one who spoke before stepped up to him and said, "Don't break your heart about it, Pat," says he. "I'll lend you my young shoes till the morning, for you seem to be a good-natured sort of boy." Well, Pat looked at the ferryman's shoes that were the size of a baby's, and he looked at his own feet, but not wishing to be uncivil. "Thank ye kindly, sir," says he, "and if your honour'll be good enough to put them on for me, maybe you won't spoil the shape." For he thought to himself, "Small blame to me if the little gentleman can't get them to fit." With that he sat down on the side of the raft, and the ferryman put on the shoes for him, and no sooner did they touch Pat's feet that they became altogether a convenient size and fitted him like wax. And more than that, when he stood up he didn't feel his blisters at all. "Bring 'em back to the raft at sunrise, Pat, me boy," says the little man, and as Pat was climbing up over the ditch, "Look round, Pat," says he, and when Pat looked round there were jewels and pearls lying at the roots of the furze bushes on the ditch, as thick as peas. "Will you help yourself or take what's given ye, Pat?" says the ferryman. "Did I ever learn manners?" says Pat. "Would ye have me help myself before company? I'll take what your honour pleases to give me, and be thankful." The ferryman picked a lot of yellow furze blossoms from the bushes, and filled Pat's pockets. "Keep 'em for love, Pat, me darlin'," says he. Pat would have liked some of the jewels, but he put the furze blossoms by for love. "Good evening to your honour," says he. "And where are you going, Pat, me dear?" says the ferryman. "I'm going home," says Pat, and if the ferryman didn't know where that was, small blame to him. "Just let me dust them shoes for you, Pat," says the ferryman, and as Pat lifted up each foot he breathed on it and dusted it with the tail of his green coat. "Home," says he, and when he let go, Pat was at his own doorstep before he could look round, and his parcels safe and sound with him. Next morning he was up with the sun and carried the ferryman's shoes back to the rath, and as he came the little man looked over the ditch. "The top of the morning to ye, honour," says Pat. "Here's your shoes." "You're an honest boy, Pat," says the little gentleman. "It's inconvenienced I am without them, for I have but one pair." "Have you looked at the yellow flowers this morning?" says he. "I've not, sir," says Pat. "I'd be loth to deceive you. I came off as soon as I was up." "Be sure to look at them when you get back, Pat," says the ferryman, "and good luck to ye." With that he disappeared, and Pat went home. He looked for the furze blossoms, as the ferryman told him, and there's not a word of truth in this tale if they weren't all pure gold pieces. Well now, Pat was so rich he went to the shoemaker to order another pair of brogues, and being a kindly, gossiping boy, the shoemaker soon learned the whole story of the ferryman and the rath, and this so stirred up the shoemaker's greed that he resolved to go the very next night himself, to see if he could not dance with the fairies and have like luck. He found his way to the rath all correct, and sure enough the fairies were dancing, and they asked him to join. He danced the soles off his brogues, as Pat did, and the ferryman lent him his shoes and sent him home in a twinkling. As he was going over the ditch, he looked round and saw the roots of the furze bushes glowing with precious stones as if they had been glowworms. "Will ye help yourself or take what's given ye?" said the ferryman. "I'll help myself if you please," says the cobbler, for he thought, "If I can't get more than Pat brought home, my fingers must all be thumbs." So he drove his hands into the bushes, and if he didn't get plenty, it wasn't for want of grasping. When he got up in the morning, he went straight to the jewels, but not a stone of the lot was more precious than roadside pebbles. "I ought not to look till I come back from the rath," says he. "It's best to do like Pat all through." But he made up his mind not to return the ferryman's shoes. "Who knows what's virtue that's in them?" he said. So he made a small pair of red leather shoes, as like them as could be, and he blacked the others upon his feet, that the fairies might not know them, and at sunrise he went back to the rath. The ferryman was looking over the ditch as before. "Good morning to ye," says he. "The top of the morning to ye, sir," says the cobbler. "Here's your shoes," and he handed him the pair that he had made, with a face as grave as a judge. The ferryman looked at them, but he said nothing, though he did not put them on. "Have you looked at the things you got last night?" says he. "I'll not deceive you, sir," says the cobbler. "I came off as soon as I was up. Saw a peep I took at them." "Be sure to look when you get back," says the ferryman, and just as the cobbler was getting over the ditch to go home, he says, "If my eyes don't deceive me," says he, "there's the least taste in life of dirt on your left shoe. Let me dust it with the tail of my coat." "Ah, that means home in a twinkling," thought the cobbler, and he held up his foot. The ferryman dusted it and muttered something the cobbler did not hear. Then, "Sure," says he, "it's the dirty pastures that you've come through, for the other shoe's just as bad." So the cobbler held up his right foot, and the ferryman rubbed that with the tail of his green coat. When all was done, the cobbler's feet seemed to tingle, and then to itch, and then to smart, and then to burn, and at last he began to dance, and he danced all round the raft, the ferryman laughing and holding his sides, and then round and round again, and he danced till he cried out with weariness, and tried to shake the shoes off, but they stuck fast, and the fairies drove him over the ditch and through the prickly furze bushes, and he danced away. Where he danced to I cannot tell. Whether he got rid of the fairy shoes I do not know. The jewels never were more than wayside pebbles, and they were swept out when his cabin was cleaned, which was not too soon, you may be sure. All this happened long ago, but there are those who say that the covetous cobbler dances still, between sunset and sunrise, around Murdoch's wrath. End of chapter 11, Murdoch's Wrath.
Chapter 12 of Old-Fashioned Fairy Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Brooke Valderrama. Old-Fashioned Fairy Tales by Juliana Horatia Gatty Ewing. Chapter 12, The Little Darner. In days gone by there lived a poor widow who had brought up her only child so well that the little lass was more helpful and handy than many a grown-up person. When other women's children were tearing and dirtying their clothes, clamoring at their mother's skirts for this and that, losing and breaking and spoiling things, and getting into mischief of all kinds, the widow's little girl, with her tiny thimble on her finger, could patch quite neatly. She was to be trusted to put anything in its proper place, and when meals were over she would stand on a little stool at the table washing up the dishes. Moreover, she could darn stockings so well that the darn looked like a part of the stocking. The slatternly mothers, who spoiled and scolded their children by turns, and had never taught them to be tidy and obedient, used often to quote the widow's little girl to their troublesome brats, and say, "Why don't you help your mother as the widow's daughter helps hers?" Thus it came about that the helpless, useless, untidy little girls hated the very name of the widow's daughter, because they were always being told of her usefulness and neatness. Now the widow's child often earned a few pence by herding sheep or pigs for the farmers, or by darning stockings for their wives, and as she could be trusted, people were very glad to employ her. One day she was keeping watch over 5 little pigs in a field, and, not to waste time, was darning a pair of stockings as well, when some of the little girls who had a spite against her resolved to play her a trick. Near the field where the little maid and the pigs were there was a wood, into which all children were strictly forbidden to go, for in the depths of the wood there lived a terrible ogre and ogress, who kidnapped all children who strayed near their dwelling. Every morning the ogre threw a big black bag over his shoulder, and stalked through the forest, making the ground shake as he walked. If he found any truant children, he propped them into the bag, and when he got home his wife cooked them for supper. The trick played upon the widow's daughter was this. 5 little girls came up the field where she was herding the 5 little pigs, and each chasing a pig, they drove them into the ogre's wood. In vain the little maid called to her flock. The pigs ran in a frightened troop into the wood, and she ran after them. When the 5 little girls saw that she had got them together again, they ran in to chase them away once more, and so they were all in the wood together, when the ground shook under them, upsetting the 6 little girls and the 5 little pigs, and as they rolled over, the ogre picked them up and put them one after the other into his bag. When they were jolting about with the pigs and the poke, as the ogre strode homewards, the 5 spiteful children were as sorry as you please, and as the pigs were always fighting and struggling to get to the top, they did not escape without some scratches, and their screams and the squealing of the little pigs made such a noise that the ogre's wife heard it 1.5 miles away, despite the depths of the wood, and she lighted a fire under the copper and filled it with water, ready to cook whatever her husband brought home. As for the widow's little daughter, she pulled her needle-book from her pocket, and every now and then she pushed a needle through the sack, that it might fall on the ground, and serve as a guide if she should ever have the chance of finding her way home again. When the ogre arrived, he emptied the sack, and sent the 6 little girls and the 5 little pigs all sprawling onto the floor, saying, "These will last us some time. Cook the fattest, and put the rest in the cellar, and whilst you get dinner ready, I will take another stroll with the bag. Luck seldom comes singly." When he had gone, the ogress looked over the children, and picked out the widow's daughter, saying, "You look the most good-humoured, and the best-tempered always make the best eating." So she sat down on the stool by the fire till the water should boil, and locked the others up in the cellar. Tears won't put the fire out, thought the little maid, so instead of crying, she pulled out the old stocking and went on with her darning. When the ogress came back from the cellar, she went up to her and looked at her work. "How you darn!" she cried. "Now that's the sort of thing I hate, and the ogre does wear such big holes in his stockings, and his feet are so large, that though my hand is not a small one, I cannot fill the heel out with my fist. And then who's to darn it neatly, I should like to know? If I had a basin big enough to fill out the heel, I think I could do it," said the little maid. The ogre scratched her big ear thoughtfully for a minute, and then she said, "To lose a chance is to cheat oneself. Why shouldn't this one darn while the others boil? Yes, I think you shall try. 6 days ought to serve for mending all the stockings, though the ogre hasn't a whole pair left, and angry enough he'll be, and when household matters are not to his mind, he puts that big sack over my head and ties it round my neck, and if you had ever done housework with your head in a poke, you know what it is. So you shall darn the stockings, and if you do them well, I'll cook one of the others first, instead of you." Saying which, the ogress fetched one of the ogre's stockings, and the widow's child put a big basin into the heel to stretch it, and began to darn. The ogress watched her till she had put all the threads one way, and when she began to run the cross threads, interlacing them with the utmost exactness, the old creature was delighted, and went to fetch another child to be cooked instead of the widow's. When the other little girl came up, she cried and screamed so that the room rang with her lamentations, and the widow's child laid down her needle and ceased working. "Why don't you go on darning?" asked the ogress. "Alas, dear mother," she said, "the little sister's cries make my heart beat so that I cannot darn evenly." "Then she must go back to the cellar for a bit," said the ogress, "and meanwhile I'll sharpen the knife." So after she had taken back the crying child, and had watched the little girl, who now darned away as skillfully as ever, the ogress took down a huge knife from the wall, and began to sharpen it on a grindstone in a corner of the kitchen. As she sharpened the knife, she glanced from time to time at the little maid, and soon perceived that she had once more ceased working. "Why don't you go on darning?" asked the ogress. "Alas, dear mother," said the child, "when I hear you sharpening that terrible knife, my hands tremble so that I cannot thread my needle." "Well, it will do now," growled the ogress, feeling the edge of the blade with her horny finger, and having seen the darning needle once more at work, she went to fetch up one of the children. As she went, she hummed what cook maids sing, "Dilly, dilly, duckling, come and be killed." But it sounded like the wheezing and groaning of a heavy old door upon its rusty hinges. When she came in, with the child in one hand and a huge knife in the other, she went up to the little darner to look at her work. The heel of the ogre's stocking was exquisitely mended, but all 7 threads. But the little maid sat idle with her hands before her. "Why don't you go on darning?" asked the ogress. "Alas, dear mother," was the reply, "when I think of my little playmate about to die, the tears blind my eyes, so that I cannot see what stitches I take. Wherefore I beg of you, dear mother, to cook one of the little pigs instead, that I may be able to go on with my work, and that a pair of stockings may be ready tomorrow morning, when the ogre will ask for them, so my playmate's life will be spared, and your head will not be put into a poke." At first the ogress would not hear of such a thing, but at last she consented, and made a stew of one of the little pigs, instead of cooking the little girl. "But supposing the ogre goes to count the children," said she, "he will find one too many." "Then let her go, dear mother," said the widow's daughter. "She will find her way home, and you will never be blamed." "But she must stir the stew with her forefinger first," said the ogress, "that it may have a human flavor." So the little girl had to stir the hot stew with her finger, which scalded it badly, and then she was set at liberty, and ran home as hard as she could, and as the little maid's needles sparkled here and there on the path, she had no difficulty in finding her way. The ogre was quite contented with his dinner, and the ogress got great praise for the way in which she had darned his stockings. Thus it went on for 4 days more, as the widow's little girl wouldn't to work if her companions were killed. The ogress cooked the pigs one after another, and to the children were all sent away with burnt forefingers. When the 5th had been dismissed, and all the pigs were eaten, the ogress said, "Tomorrow you will have to be stewed, and now I wish I had kept one of the others, that I might have saved you altogether to work for me. However, there is one comfort, the stockings are finished." But meanwhile the other children had gotten safely home, and had told their tale, and all the men of the place set off at once to attack the ogre, and release the widow's child. Guided by the needles, they arrived just as the ogress was sharpening the big knife for the last time. So they killed the ogre and his wife, and took the industrious little maid back to her mother. The other little girls were now very repentant, and when their fingers were well, they all learned to darn stockings at once. And as there was now no danger about going into the wood, it was no longer forbidden, and this being the case, the children were much less anxious to play there than formerly. End of chapter 12.
Chapter 13 of Old-Fashioned Fairy Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Benjamin Jones. Old-Fashioned Fairy Tales by Juliana Horatia Gatty Ewing. Chapter 13
The Fiddler in the Fairy Ring. Generations ago, there once lived a farmer's son, who had no great harm in him, and no great good either. He always meant well, but he had a poor spirit, and was too fond of idle company. One day his father sent him to the market with some sheep for sale, and when business was over for the day, the rest of the country folk made ready to go home, and more than one of them offered the lad a lift in his cart. "Thank you kindly, all the same," said he, "but I am going back across the downs with Limping Tim." Then out spoke a steady old farmer, and bade the lad go home with the rest, and by the main road, for Limping Tim was an idle, graceless kind of fellow, who fiddled for his livelihood. But what else he did to earn the money he squandered, no one knew. And as to the sheep path over the downs, it stands to reason that the highway is better travelling after sunset, for the other is no such very short cut, and has a big fairy ring so near it that a butter woman might brush it with the edge of her market cloak as she turned the brow of the hill. But the farmer's son would go his own way, and that was with Limping Tim across the downs. So they started, and the fiddler had his fiddle in his hand and a bundle of marketings under his arm, and he sang snatches of strange songs, the like of which the lad had never heard before, and the moon drew out their shadows over the short grass till they were as long as the great stones of Stonehenge. At last they turned the hill, and the fairy ring looked dark under the moon, and the farmer's son blessed himself that they were passing it quietly, when Limping Tim suddenly pulled his cloak from his back, and handing it to his companion, cried, "Hold this for a moment, will you? I'm wanted. They're calling me." "I hear nothing," said the farmer's son, but before he got the words out of his mouth, the fiddler had completely disappeared. He shouted aloud, but in vain. He had begun to think of proceeding on his way, when the fiddler's voice cried, "Catch!" and there came flying at him from the direction of the fairy ring the bundle of marketings which the fiddler had been carrying. "It's in my way," he then heard the fiddler cry. "Ah, this is dancing! Come in, my lad, come in!" But the farmer's son was totally without prudence, and he took good care to keep a safe distance from the fairy ring. "Come back, Tim! Come back!" he shouted, and received no answer. He adjured his friend to break the bonds that withheld him, and return to the right way, as wisely as one man can counsel another. After talking for some time to no purpose, he again heard his friend's voice crying, "Take care of it for me! The money dances out of my pocket!" And wherewith the fiddler's purse was hurled to its feet, where it fell with a heavy clinking of gold within. He picked it up, and renewed his warnings and entreatings, but in vain, and after waiting for a long time, he made the best of his way home alone, hoping that the fiddler would follow, and come to reclaim his property. The fiddler never came, and when at last there was a fuss about his disappearance, the farmer's son, who had but a poor spirit, began to be afraid to tell the truth of the matter. "Who knows but that they may accuse me of theft?" says he. So he hid the cloak and the bundle and the money bag in the garden. But when 3 months passed, and still the fiddler did not return, it was whispered that the farmer's son had been his last companion, and that the place was searched, and they found the cloak and the bundle and the money bag, and the lad was taken to prison. Now when it was too late, he plucked up a spirit and told the truth, but no one believed him, and it was said that he had murdered the fiddler for the sake of his money and goods. And he was taken before the judge, found guilty, and sentenced to death. Fortunately, his old mother was a wise woman, and when she heard that he was condemned, she said, "Only follow my directions, and we may save you yet, for I guess how it is." So she went to the judge and begged for her son 3 favors before his death. "I will grant them," said the judge, "if you will not ask for his life." "The first," said the woman, "is that he may choose the place where the gallows shall be erected. The second, that he may fix the hour of his execution. And the third favor is, that you will not fail to be present." "I will grant all 3. But when he had learned that the criminal had chosen a certain hill on the downs for the place of execution, and an hour before midnight for the time, he sent to beg the sheriff to bear him company on this important occasion. The sheriff placed himself at the judge's disposal, but he commanded the attendance of the gaoler as some sort of protection, and the gaoler, for his part, implored his reverence the chaplain to be of the party, as the hill was not in good spiritual repute. So when the time came, the 4 started together, and the hangman and the farmer's son went before them to the foot of the gallows. Just as the rope was being prepared, the farmer's son called to the judge and said, "If your honor will walk 20 paces down the hill to where you see a bit of paper, you will learn the fate of the fiddler." "That is no doubt a copy of the poor man's last confession," thought the judge. "Murder will out, Mr. Sheriff," said he, and in the interests of the truth and justice he hastened to pick up the paper. But the farmer's son had dropped it as he came along, by his mother's direction, in such a place that the judge could not pick it up without putting his foot on the edge of the fairy ring. No sooner has he done so than he perceived an innumerable company of little people dressed in green cloaks and hoods, who were dancing round in a circle as wide as the ring itself. They were all about 2 feet high, and had aged faces, brown and withered, like knots on gnarled trees, in hedge bottoms, and they squinted horribly. But in spite of their seeming age, they flew around and round like children. "Mr. Sheriff! Mr. Sheriff!" cried the judge, "come and see the dancing, and hear the music too, which is so lively it makes the soles of my feet tingle." "There is no music, my lord judge," said the sheriff, running down the hill. "It is the wind whistling over the grass that your lordship hears." But when the sheriff had put his foot by the judge's foot, he saw and heard the same, and cried, quick, Guller, come down. I should like you to be the witness of this matter, and you may take my arm, Guller, for the music makes me feel unsteady." "There is no music, sir," said the Guller, "but your worship doubtless hears the creaking of the gallows." But no sooner had the Guller's feet touched the fairy ring than he saw and heard like the rest, and he called lustily to the chaplain to come and stop this unhallowed measure. "It's a delusion of the evil one," said the parson. "There is not a sound in the air but the distant croaking of some frogs." But when he too touched the ring, he perceived his mistake. At this moment the moon shone out, and in the middle of the ring they saw Limping Tim the fiddler playing till great drops stood out on his forehead, and dancing as madly as he played. "Ah, you rascal!" cried the judge, "this is where you've been all this time, and a better man than you as good as hanged for you. But you shall come home now." Saying which, he ran in and seized the fiddler by the arm, but Limping Tim resisted so stoutly that the sheriff had to go to the judge's assistance, and even then the fairies so pinched and hindered them that the sheriff was obliged to call upon the Guller to put his arms about his waist, who persuaded the chaplain to add his strength to the string. But as ill luck would have it, just as they were getting off, one of the fairies picked up Limping Tim's fiddle, which had fallen in the scuffle, and began to play, and as began to play, everyone began to dance. The fiddler, and the judge, and the sheriff, and the Guller, and even the chaplain. "Hangman! Hangman!" screamed the judge, as he lifted first one leg, then the other, to the tune, "Come down and catch hold of his reverence, the chaplain. The prisoner is pardoned, and he can lay hold too." The hangman knew the judge's voice, and ran towards it, but as they were now quite within the ring, he could see nothing, neither of him or his companions. The farmer's son followed, and warning the hangman not to touch the ring, he directed him to stretch his hands forwards in hopes of catching hold of someone. In a few minutes the wind blew the chaplain's cassock against the hangman's fingers, and he caught the parson round the waist. The farmer's son then seized him in like fashion, and each holding firmly by the other, the fiddler, the judge, the sheriff, the Guller, the parson, the hangman, and the farmer's son all got safely out of the charmed circle. "Oh, you scoundrel," said the judge to the fiddler, "I have very good mind to hang you up on the gallows without further ado." But the fiddler only looked like one possessed, and upbraided the farmer's son for not having patience to wait 3 minutes for him. "3 minutes!" cried he. "Why, you've been here for 3 months and a day." This the fiddler would not believe, and he seemed in every way beside himself. They led him home, still upbraiding his companion, and crying. This the fiddler would not believe, and as he seemed in every way beside himself, they led him home, still upbraiding his companion, and crying continually for his fiddle. His neighbors watched him closely, but one day he escaped from their care, and wandered away over the hills to seek his fiddle, and came back no more. His dead body was found upon the downs, face downward, with the fiddle in his arms. Some said he had really found the fiddle where he had left it, and had been lost in a mist, and died of exposure. But others held that he had perished differently, and led to his death at the door of the fairy dancers. As to the farmer's son, it was said that thenceforth he went home from the market by the high road, and spoke the truth straight out, and was more careful of his company. End of chapter 13. The Fiddler in the Fairy Ring.
Chapter 14 of Old-Fashioned Fairy Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Old-Fashioned Fairy Tales by Juliana Horatia Gatty Ewing. Chapter 14. I Won't. Don't care, so they say, fell into a goose pond, and I won't is apt to come to no better an end. At least my grandmother tells me that was how the miller had to quit his native town and leave the tip of his nose behind him. It all comes from his being allowed to say I won't when he was quite a little boy. His mother thought that he looked pretty when he was pouting, and that wilfulness gave him an air which distinguished him from other people's children. And when she found out that his lower lip was becoming so big that it spoilt his beauty, and that his wilfulness gained his way twice and stood in his way 8 times out of 10, it was too late to alter him. Then she said, "Dearest Abinadab, do be more obliging." And he replied, as she had taught him, "I won't." And he always took what he could get, and would neither give nor give up to other people. This, he thought, was the best way to get out of life more than one's neighbors. Amongst other things, he made a point of taking in the middle of the footpath. "Will you allow me to pass you, sir? I am in a hurry," said a voice behind him one day. "I won't," said Abinadab, on which a poor washerwoman with her basket scrambled down into the road, and Abinadab chuckled. Next day he was walking as before. "Will you allow me to pass you, sir? I am in a hurry," said a voice behind him. "I won't," said Abinadab, on which he was knocked into the ditch, and the Baron walked on and left him to get out of the mud on whichever side he liked. He quarrelled with his friends till they had none left, and he quarrelled with the tradesmen of the town till there was only one who would serve him, and this man offended him at last. "I'll show you who's master," said the miller. "I won't pay a penny of your bill, not a penny." "Sir," said the tradesman, "my giving you offence now is no just reason why you should refuse to pay for what you have had and been satisfied with. I must beg you to pay me at once." "I won't," said the miller, "and what I say I mean. I won't, I tell you. I won't." So the tradesman summoned him before the justice, and the justice condemned him to pay the bill and the costs of the suit. "I won't," said the miller. So they put him in prison, and in prison he would have remained if his mother had not paid the money to obtain his release. By and by she died, and left him her blessing and some very good advice, which, as is sometimes the case with bequests, would have been more useful if it had come earlier. The miller's mother had taken a great deal of trouble off his hands, which now fell into them. She took in all the small bags of grist, which the country folk brought to the ground, and kept account of them, and spoke civilly to the customers, big and small. But these small matters irritated the miller. "I may be the slave of all the old women in the countryside," said he, "but I won't. They shall see that I won't." So he put up a notice to say that he would only receive grist at a certain hour on certain days. Now but a third of the old women could read the notice, and they did not attend to it. People came as before, but the miller locked the door of the mill and sat in the counting-house and chuckled. "My good friend," said his neighbours, "you can't do business in this way. If a man lives by trade, he must serve his customers, and a miller must take in grist when it comes to the mill." "Others may, if they please," said the miller, "but I won't. When I make a rule, I stick to it." "Take advice, man, or you'll be ruined," said his friends. "I won't," said the miller. In a few weeks all the country folk turned their donkeys' heads towards the windmill on the heath. It was a little further to go, but the windmiller took custom when it came to him, gave honest measure, and added civil words gratis. The other miller was ruined. All you can do now is leave the mill while you can still pay the rent, and try another trade, said his friends. I won't, said the miller. Shall I be turned out of the house where I was born, because the country folks are fools? However, he could not pay the rent, and the landlord found another tenant. You must quit, he said to the miller. That I won't, said the miller, not for 50 new tenants. So the landlord sent for the constables, and he was carried out, which is not a dignified way of changing one's residence. But then, it is not easy to be obstinate and dignified at the same time. His wrath against the landlord knew no bounds. Was there ever such a brute? He cried. Would any man of spirit hold his home at the whim of a landlord? I will never rent another house as long as I live. But you must live somewhere, said his friends. I won't, said the miller. He was no longer a young man, and the new tenant pitied him. The poor old fellow is out of his senses, he said, and he let him sleep in one of his barns. One of the milk cats found out that there was a new warm bed in this barn, and she came and lived there too, and kept away the mice. One night, however, Mrs. Pussy disturbed the miller's rest. She was in and out of the window constantly, and meowed horribly into the bargain. It seems a man can't even sleep in peace, said the miller. If this happens again, you'll go into the mill race to sing to the fishes. The next night the cat was still on alert, and the following morning the miller tied a stone around her neck and threw her into the water. Oh, spare the poor thing! There's a good soul, said a bystander. I won't, said the miller. I told her what would happen. When his back was turned, however, the bystander got Pussy out and took her home with him. Now the cat was away, the mice could play, and they played hide and seek over the miller's nightcap. It came to such a pass that there was no rest to be had. I won't go to bed, I declare. I won't, said the miller. So he sat up all night in an armchair, and threw everything he could lay his hands on at the corners where he could hear the mice scuffling, till the place was topsy-turvy. Towards morning he lit a candle and dressed himself. He was in a terrible humour, and when he began to shave, his hand shook and he cut himself. The draughts made the flame of the candle unsteady too, and the shadow of the miller's nose, which was a large one, fell in uncertain shapes upon his cheeks, and interfered with the progress of the razor. At first he thought he would wait until daylight. Then his temper got the better of him. I won't, he said. I won't. Why should I? So he began again, and he held on by his nose to steady his cheeks, and he gave it such a spiteful pinch that the tears came into his eyes. Matters have come to a pretty pass when a man's own nose is to stand in his light, said he. By and by a gust of wind came through the window. Up flared the candle, and the shadow of the miller's nose danced half over his face, and the razor gashed his chin. Transported with fury, he struck at it before he could think what he was doing. The razor was very sharp, and the tip of the miller's nose came off as clean as his whiskers. When daylight came, and he saw himself in the glass, he resolved to leave the place. I won't stay here and be a laughing-stock, said he. As he trudged out to the highway, with his bundle on his back, the baron met him and pitied him. He dismounted from his horse, and leading it up to the miller, he said, Friend, you are elderly to be going far afoot. I will lend you my mare to take you to your destination. When you are there, knot the reins and throw them on her shoulders, saying, Home. She will then return to me. But mark one thing, she is not used to whip nor spur. Humor her, and she will carry you well and safely." The miller mounted willingly enough, and set forward. At first the mare was a little restive. The miller had no spurs on, but, in spite of the baron's warning, he kicked her with his heels. On this she danced till the miller's hat and bundle flew right and left, and he was very near to following them. "Ah, you vixen!" he cried. "You think I'll humour you as the baron does. But I won't. No, you shall see that I won't." And gripping his walking-stick firmly in his hand, he belaboured the baron's mare as if she had been a donkey, on which she sent the miller clean over her head, and cantered back to the castle, and wherever it was that he went to, he had to walk. He never returned to his native village, and everyone was glad to be rid of him. One must bear and forbear with his neighbours if he hopes to be regretted when he departs. But my grandmother says that long after the mill had fallen into ruin, the story was told as a warning to wilful children of the miller who cut his nose off to spite his own face. End of chapter 14. I won't.
Chapter 15 of Old-Fashioned Fairy Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Melanie Valderrama. Old-Fashioned Fairy Tales by Juliana Horatia Gatty Ewing. Chapter 15, The Magic Jar. There was once a young fellow whom fortune had blessed with a good mother, a clever head, and a strong body. But beyond this, she had not much favored him. And though able and willing to work, he had often little to do and less to eat. But his mother had taught him to be contented with his own lot and to feel for others. Moreover, from her he inherited a great love for flowers. One day, when his pockets were emptiest, a fair was held in the neighboring town, and he must needs go as well as the rest, though he had no money to spend. But he stuck a buttercup in his cap, for which he had nothing to pay, and strode along as merrily as the most. Towards evening some of the merrymakers became riotous, and a party of them fell upon an old Jew who was keeping a stall of glass and china, and would smash his stock. Now as the Jew stood before his booth, beseeching them to spare his property, up came the strong young man, with the flower still unwithered in his cap, and he took the old Jew's part and defended him. For from childhood his mother had taught him to feel for others. So those who would have ill-treated the old Jew now moved off, and the young man stayed with him till he had packed up his wares. Then the Jew turned towards him and said, "My son, he who delivers the oppressed and has respect unto the aged has need of no reward, for the blessing of him that blesseth is about him. Nevertheless, that I may not seem ungrateful, choose, I pray thee, one of these china jars, and take it to thee for thine own. If thou shalt choose well, it may be of more use to thee than presently appears." Thereupon the young man examined the jars, which were highly ornamented with many figurines and devices, but he chose one that was comparatively plain. Only it had a bunch of flowers painted on the front, round which was a pretty device in spots or circles of gold. Then said the Jew, "My son, why have you chosen this jar when there are others so much finer?" The young man said, "Because the flowers please me, and I have a love for flowers." Then said the Jew, "Happy is he whose tastes are simple. Moreover, herein is a rare wisdom, and thou hast gained that which is the most valuable of my possessions. This jar has properties which I will further explain to thee. It was given to me by a wise woman, subject to this condition, that I must expose it for sale from sunrise to sunset at the yearly fair. When I understood this, I took counsel with myself how I should preserve it, and I bought other china jars of more apparent value, and I marked them all with the same price. For I said within myself, there is no man who does not desire to get as much as he can for his money. Therefore, from its contrast with these others, my jar is safe. And it was even so. For truly many have desired to buy the jar because of the delicate beauty of the flowers, if I would have sold it for less than others, which seem more valuable. Many times it has been almost gone, but when I have shown the others at the same price, my customers have reviled me, saying, Dog of a Jew, dost thou ask as much for this as these others, which are manifestly worth double? And they have either departed, cursing me, and taking nothing, or they have bought one of the more richly decorated jars at the same price. For verily in most men the spirit of covetousness is stronger than the love of beauty, and they rather desire to get much for their money than to obtain that which is suitable and convenient. But in thee, O young man, I have beheld a rare wisdom. to choose that which is good in thine eyes and suitable to thy needs, rather than that which satisfieth the lust of overreaching. And lo, what I have so long kept from thousands has become thine. Then the young man wished to restore to the Jew the jar he valued so highly, and to choose another. But the Jew refused, saying, A gift cannot be recalled. Moreover, I will now explain to thee its uses. Within the jar lies a toad, whose spit is poison, but it will never spit at its master. Every evening thou must feed it with bread and milk, when it will fall asleep, and at sunrise in the morning it will awake and breathe heavily against the side of the jar, which will thus become warm. As it warms, the flowers will blossom out and become real and full of perfume, and thou wilt be able to pluck them without diminishing their number. Moreover, these 12 round spots of gold will drop off and become 12 gold pieces, which will be thine. And thus it will be every day. Only thou must thyself rise with the sun and gather the flowers and the gold with thine own hands. Furthermore, when the jar cools, the flowers and gilding will be as before. Fare thee well. And even as he spoke, the Jew lifted the huge crate of china onto his back and disappeared among the crowd. All came about as the Jew had promised. As he had 12 gold pieces a day, the young man now wanted for nothing, besides which he had fresh flowers on his table all the year round. Now it is well said, Thy business is my business, and the business of all beside, for every man's affairs are his neighbor's property. Thus it came about that all those who lived near the young man were perplexed that he had such beautiful flowers in all seasons, and esteemed it as an injury to themselves that he should have them and give no explanation as to whence they came. At last it came to the ears of the king, and he also was disturbed, for he was curious and fond of prying into small matters, a taste which ill becomes those of high position. But the king had no child to succeed him, and he was always suspecting those about him of plotting to obtain the crown, and thus he came to be forever prying into the affairs of his subjects. Now when he heard of the young man who had flowers on his table all the year round, he desired one of his officers to go and question him as to how he obtained them. But the young man contrived to evade his questions, and the matter was at rest for a while. Then the king sent another messenger with orders to press the young man more closely, and because the young man disdained to tell a lie, he said, I get the flowers from yon china jar. Then the messenger returned and said to the king, The young man says that he gets the flowers from a certain china jar which stands in his room. Then said the king, Bring the contents of the jar hither to me. And the messenger returned and brought the toad. But when the king laid hold upon the toad, it spat in his face, and he was poisoned and died. Then the toad sat upon the king's mouth and would not be enticed away, and everyone feared to touch it because it spat poison. And they called the wise men of the council, and they performed certain rites to charm away the toad, and yet it would not go. But after 3 days the master of the toad came to the palace, and without saying who he was, he desired to be permitted to try and get the toad from the corpse of the king. And when he was taken into the king's chamber, he stood and beckoned to the toad, saying, The person of the king and the bodies of the dead are sacred, wherefore come away. And the toad crawled from the king's face and came to him, and did not spit at him, and he put it back into the jar. Then said the wise men, There is no one so fit to succeed to the kingdom as this man is, both for wisdom of speech and for the power of command. And what they said pleased the people, and the young man was made king, and in due time he married an amiable and talented princess and had children, and he ruled the kingdom well and wisely and was beloved until his death. Now then, after the lapse of many years he died, there was great grief among the people, and his body was laid out in his own room, and the people were permitted to come and look upon his face for the last time. And among the crowd there appeared an aged Jew. And he did not weep as did the others, but he came and stood by the bier, and gazed upon the face of the dead king in silence. And after a while he exclaimed and said, Oh, wonderful spectacle! A man and not covetous, a ruler and not oppressive, contented in poverty and moderate in wealth, elect of the people and beloved to the end. And when he had said this, he again became silent and stood as one astonished. And no one knew when he came in, nor perceived when he departed. But when they came to search for the china jar, it was gone, and could never afterwards be found. End of chapter 15.
Chapter 16 of Old-Fashioned Fairy Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jessica Jones. Old-Fashioned Fairy Tales by Juliana Horatia Gatty. The First Wife's Wedding Ring. Many years ago there lived a certain worthy man who was twice married.
By his first wife he had a son, who soon after his mother's death resolved to become a soldier, and to go to foreign lands. "When one has seen the world, one values home the more," he said, "and if I live I shall return." So the father gave him a blessing and his mother's wedding ring, saying, "Keep this ring, and then, however long you stay away, and however changed you may become, by this token I shall know you to be my true son and heir." In a short time the father married again, and by this marriage also he had one son. Years passed by, and the elder brother did not return, and at last everyone believed him to be dead. But in reality he was alive, and after a long time he turned his step homewards. He was so much changed by age and travelling that only his mother would have known him again, but he had the ring tied safe and fast around his neck. One night, however, he was too far from shelter to get a bed, so he slept under a hedge, and when he woke in the morning the string was untied and the ring was gone. He spent the whole day in searching for it, but in vain, and at last he resolved to proceed and explain the matter to his father. The old man was overjoyed to see him, and fully believed his tale. With the second wife it was otherwise. She was greatly displeased to think that her child was not now to be the sole heir of his father's goods, and she so pestered and worked upon the old man by artful and malicious speeches that he consented to send away the newcomer till he should have found the first wife's wedding ring. "Is the homestead I have taken such care of," she cried, "to go to the first vagrant who comes in with a brown face and ragged coat, pretending that he is your son?" So the soldier was sent about his business, but his father followed him to the gate and slipped some money into his hand, saying, "God speed you, back again with the ring." It was Sunday morning, and the bells were ringing for service as he turned sadly away. "Ding dong," rang the bells. "Ding dong. Why do you not come to church like others? Why are you not dressed in your Sunday clothes? And wherefore do you have such doleful sighs whilst we ring merrily? Ding dong, ding dong." "Is there not a cause?" replied the soldier. "This day I am turned out of home and heritage, though indeed I am the true heir." "Nevertheless, we shall ring for your return," said the bells. As he went, the sun shone brightly on the green fields and in the soldier's eyes, and said, "See how brightly I shine! But you, comrade, why is your face so cloudy?" "Is there not a good reason?" replied he. "This day I am turned out of home and heritage, and yet I am the true heir." "Nevertheless, I shall shine on your return," said the sun. Along the road the hawthorn hedges were white with blossom. "Hey day!" they cried. "Who is that comes, trimp tramp, with face as long as a poplar tree? Cheer up, friend, it is spring, sweet spring. All is now full of hope and joy. And why should you look so sour?" "May I not be excused?" said the soldier. "This day I am turned out of home and heritage, and yet I am the true heir." "Nevertheless, we shall blossom when you return," said the hedges. When he wandered for 3 days and 3 nights, all he had was spent, and there was no shelter to be seen but a dark, gloomy forest which stretched before him. Just then he saw a small, weazened old woman who was trying to lift a bundle of sticks on her back. "That is too heavy for you, good mother," said the soldier, and he raised and adjusted it for her. "Have you just come here?" muttered the old crone. "Then the best thanks I can give you is to bid you get away as fast as you can." "I never retreated yet, dame," said the soldier, and on he went. Presently he met with a giant who was strolling along by the edge of the wood, knocking the cones off the tops of the fir trees with his fingernails. He was an ill-favoured looking monster, but he said civilly enough, "You look in want of employment, comrade. Will you take service with me?" "I must first know 2 things," answered the soldier, "my work and my wages." "Your work," said the giant, "is to cut a path through this wood to the other side, but then you shall have a year and a day to do it in. If you do it within the time, you will find at the other end a magpie's nest, in which is the ring of which you are in search. The nest also contains the crown jewels which have been stolen, and if you take these to the king, you will need no further reward. But, on the other hand, if the work is not done within that time, you will thenceforth be my servant, without wages." "It is a hard bargain," said the soldier, "but need knows no law, and I agree to the conditions." When he came to the giant's abode, he was greatly astonished to see the little weazened old woman. She showed no signs of recognizing him, however, and the soldier observed a like discretion. He soon discovered that she was the giant's wife, and in much dread of her husband, who treated her with great cruelty. "Tomorrow you shall begin to work," said the giant. "If you please," said the soldier, and before he went to bed he carried in water and wood for the old woman. "There's a kinship in trouble," he said. Next morning the giant led him to a certain place on the outskirts of the forest, and giving him an axe, said, "The sooner you begin the better, and you may see that it is not difficult." Saying which, he took hold of one of the trees by the middle, and snapped it off as one might pluck a flower. "Thus to thee, but how to me?" said the soldier, and when the giant departed he set to work, but although he was strong and worked willingly, the trees seemed almost as hard as stone, and he made little progress. When he returned at night, the giant asked him how he got on. "The trees are very hard," said he. "So they always say," replied the giant. "I have always had idle servants." "I will not be called idle a second time," thought the soldier, and the next day he went early and worked to his utmost, but the result was very small, and when he came home looking weary and disappointed, he could not fail to perceive that this gave great satisfaction to the giant. Matters had gone on thus for some time, when one morning, as he went to work, he found the little old woman gathering sticks as before. "Listen," said she, "he shall not treat you as he has treated others. Count 70 to the left from where you are working and begin again. But do not let him know you have made a fresh start, and do a little at the old place from time to time, as a blind." And before he could thank her, the old woman was gone. Without more ado, however, he counted 70 from the old place, and hit the 70th tree with such a blow with his axe that it came crashing down then and there. And he found that, one after another, the trees yielded to his blows as if they were touchwood. He did a good day's work, gave a few strokes in the old spot, and came home, taking care to look as gloomy as before. Day by day he got deeper and deeper into the wood, the trees falling before him like dry elder twigs. And now the hardest part of his work was walking backwards and forwards from the giant's home, for the forest seemed almost interminable. But on the 366th day from his first meeting with the giant, the soldier cut fairly through on to an open plain, and as the light streamed in, a magpie flew away, and on searching her nest, the soldier found his mother's wedding ring. He also found many precious stones of priceless value, which were evidently the lost crown jewels, and as his term of service with the giant was now ended, he did not trouble himself to return, but with the ring and jewels in his pocket set off to find his way to the capital. He soon fell in with a good-humored fellow, who showed him the way and pointed out everything of interest on the road. As they drew near, one of the royal carriages was driving out of the city gates, in which sat 3 beautiful ladies who were the king's daughters. "The 2 eldest are engaged to marry 2 neighboring princes," said the companion. "And whom is the youngest to marry?" asked the soldier, "for she is by far the most beautiful." "She will never marry," answered the companion, "for she is pledged to a man who shall find the crown jewels, and cut a path through the stone-wood forest that border the king's domains, and that is much as if she were promised to the man who should fetch down the moon for her to play with. For the jewels are lost beyond recall, and the wood is an enchanted forest." "Nevertheless, she shall be wed with my mother's ring," thought the soldier, but he kept his own counsel, and waited till he had smartened himself up before he sought an audience of the king. His claim upon the princess was fully proved. The king heaped honors and riches upon him, and he made himself so acceptable to his bride-elect that the wedding was fixed for an early day. "May I bring my old father, madame?" he asked of the princess. "That you certainly may," said she. "A good son makes a good husband." As he entered his native village, the hedges were in blossom, the sun shone, and the bells rang for his return. His stepmother now welcomed him and was very anxious to go to court also. But her husband said, "No, you took such good care of the homestead, it is but fit that you should look to it whilst I am away." As to the giant, when he found that he had been outwitted, he went off, and was never more heard of in those parts. But the soldier took his wife into the city, and cared for her to the day of her death. End of chapter 16 of Old-Fashioned Fairy Tales.
Chapter 17 of Old-Fashioned Fairy Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kent Price. Old-Fashioned Fairy Tales by Juliana Horatia Gatty Ewing. The Magician Turned Mischief Maker. There was once a wicked magician who prospered and did much evil for many years. But there came a day when vengeance, disguised as a blind beggar, overtook him and outwitted him, and stole his magic wand. With this he had been accustomed to turn those who offended him into any shape he pleased, and now that he had lost it, he could only transform himself. As vengeance was returning to his place, he passed through a village, the inhabitants of which had formerly lived in great terror of the magician, and told them of the downfall of his power. But they only said, "Blind beggars have long tongues. One must not believe all one hears," and shrugged their shoulders and left him. Then vengeance waved the wand and said, "As you have doubted me, distress each other," and so departed. By and by he came to another village and told the news. But here the villagers were full of delight and made a feast and put the blind beggar in the place of honor, who, when he departed, said, "As you have done by me, deal with each other always," and went on to the next village. In this place he was received with even warmer welcome, and when the feast was over, the people brought him to the bridge which led out of the village and gave him a guide dog to help him on his way. Then the blind beggar waved the wand once more and said, "Those who are so good to strangers must needs be good to each other. But that nothing may be wanting to the peace of this place, I grant to the beasts and the birds in it that they may understand the language of men." Then he broke the wand in pieces and threw it into the stream. And when the people turned their heads back again from watching the bits as they floated away, the blind beggar was gone. Meanwhile, the magician was wild with rage at the loss of his wand, for all his pleasure was to do harm and hurt. But when he came to himself, he said, "One can do a good deal of harm with his tongue. I will turn mischief maker, and when the place is too hot to hold me, I can escape in what form I please." Then he came to the first village, where vengeance had gone before, and here he lived for a year and a day in various disguises, and he made more misery with his tongue than he had ever accomplished in any other year with his magic wand. For everyone distrusted his neighbor and was ready to believe ill of him. So parents disowned their children, and husband and wives parted, and lovers broke faith, and servants and masters disagreed, and old friends became bitter enemies, till at last the place was intolerable even to the magician, and he changed himself into a cockchafer and flew to the next village where vengeance had gone before. Here also he dwelt for a year and a day, and then he left it because he could do no harm. For those who loved each other trusted each other, and the magician made mischief in vain. In one of his disguises he was detected, and only escaped with his life from the enraged villagers by changing himself into a cockchafer and flying on to the next place where vengeance had gone before. In this village he made less mischief than in the first, and more than in the second, and he exercised all his art, and changed his disguises constantly, but the dogs knew him under all. One dog, the oldest dog in the place, was keeping watch over the miller's house when he saw the magician approaching in the disguise of an old woman. "Do you see that old witch?" said he to the sparrows who were picking up stray bits of grain in the yard. "With her evil tongue she is parting my master's daughter and the finest young fellow in the countryside. She puts lies and truth together with more skill than you patch moss and feathers to build nests. And when she is asked where she heard this or that, she says, 'A little bird told me so.'" "We never told her," said the sparrows indignantly, "and if we had your strength, Master Keeper, she should not malign us long." "I believe you are right," said Master Keeper. "Of what avail is it that we have learned the language of men if we do not help them to the utmost of our powers? She shall torment my young mistress no more." Saying which, he flew upon the disguised magician as he entered the gate, and would have torn him limb from limb, but that the mischief-maker changed himself, as before, to a cockchafer, and flew hastily from the village. And thus he might doubtless have escaped to do yet further harm, had not 3 cock-sparrows overtaken him just before he crossed the bridge. From 3 sides they hemmed him in, crying, "Which of us told you? Which of us told you? Which of us told you?" and pecked him to pieces before he could transform himself again. After which peace and prosperity befell all the neighborhood. This was the end of chapter 17.
Chapter 18 of Old-Fashioned Fairy Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Alex Martin. Old-Fashioned Fairy Tales by Juliana Horatia Gatty Ewing. Chapter 18. Knave and Fool. A fool and a knave once set up house together, which shows what a fool the fool was. The knave was delighted with the agreement, and the fool thought himself most fortunate to have met with a companion who would supply his lack of mother wit. As neither of them liked to work, the knave proposed that they should live upon their joint savings as long as these should last, and to avoid disputes, that they should use the fool's share till it came to an end, and then begin upon the knave's stocking. So, for a short time they lived in great comfort at the fool's expense, and were very good company, for easy times make easy tempers. Just when the store was exhausted, the knave came running to the fool with an empty bag and a wry face, crying, "Dear friend, what shall we do? This bag, which I had safely buried under a gooseberry bush, has been taken up by some thief, and all my money stolen. My savings were twice as large as yours, but now that they are gone, and I can no longer perform my share of the bargain, I fear our partnership must be dissolved." "Not so, dear friend," said the fool, who was very good-natured. "We have shared good luck together, and now we will share poverty. But as nothing is left, I fear we must seek work." "You speak very wisely," said the knave. "And what, for instance, can you do?" "Very little," said the fool, "but that little I do well." "So do I," said the knave. "Now can you plough, or sow, or feed cattle, or plant crops?" "Farming is not my business," said the fool. "Nor mine," said the knave. "But no doubt you are a handicraftsman. Are you clever at carpentry, masonry work, tailoring, or shoemaking?" "I do not doubt that I should have been had I learned the trades," said the fool, "but I never was bound apprentice." "It is the same with myself," said the knave. "But you may have finer talents. Can you paint, or play the fiddle?" "I never tried," said the fool, "so I don't know." "Just my case," said the knave. "And now, since we can't find work, I propose that we travel till work finds us." The 2 comrades accordingly set forth, and they went on, till they came to the foot of a hill, where a merchantman was standing by his wagon, which had broken down. "You seem 2 strong men," said he as they advanced. "If you will carry this chest of valuables up to the top of the hill, and down to the bottom on the other side, where there is an inn, I will give you 2 gold pieces for your trouble." The knave and the fool consented to this, saying, "Work has found us at last," and they lifted the box onto their shoulders. "Turn and turn about," said the knave, "but the best turn between friends is a good turn. So I will lead the way uphill, which is the hardest kind of travelling, and you shall go first downhill, the easy half of our journey." The fool thought this proposal a very generous one, and not knowing that the lower end of their burden was the heavy one, he carried it all the way. When they got to the inn, the merchant gave each of them a gold piece, and as the accommodation was good, they remained where they were till their money was spent. After this, they lived there a while on credit, and when that was exhausted, they rose one morning, whilst the landlord was still in bed, and pursued their journey leaving old scores behind them. They had been a long time without work or food, when they came upon a man who sat by the roadside breaking stones, with a quart of porridge and a spoon in a tin pot beside him. "You look hungry, friend," said he, "and I, for my part, want to get away. If you will break up this heap, you shall have the porridge for supper. But when you have eaten it, put the pot and spoon under the hedge, that I may find them when I return." "If we eat first, we shall have strength for our work," said the knave, "and as there is only one spoon, we must eat by turns. But fairly divide, friendly abide. As you went first the latter part of our journey, I will begin on this occasion. When I stop, you fall to, and eat as many spoonfuls as I ate. Then I will follow you in like fashion, and so on till the pot is empty." "Nothing could be fairer," said the fool, and the knave began to eat, and went on till he had eaten a third of the porridge. The fool, who had counted every spoonful, now took his turn, and ate precisely as much as his comrade. The knave then began again, and was exact to a mouthful, but had emptied the pot. Thus the knave had twice as much as the fool, who could not see where he had been cheated. They then set to work. "And there is only one hammer," said the knave. "We must work as we slept, by turns. And as I began last time, you shall begin this. After you have worked a while, I will take the hammer from you, and do as much myself whilst you rest. Then you shall take it up again, and so on, till the heap is finished." "It is not everyone who is as just as you," said the fool, and taking up the hammer, he set to work with a will. The knave took care to let him go on till he had broken a third of the stones, and then he did as good a share himself, after which the fool began again, and finished the heap. By this means the fool did twice as much work as the knave, and yet he could not complain. As they moved on again, the fool perceived that the knave was taking the can and the spoon with him. "I am sorry to see you do that, friend," said he. "It's a very small theft," said the knave. "The can cannot have cost more than 6 pence when new." "That is not what I meant," said the fool, "so much as that I fear that the owner will find it out." "He will only think the things have been stolen by some vagrant," said the knave, "which, indeed, they would be, if we left them. But as you seem to have a tender conscience, I will keep them myself." After a while they met a farmer, who offered to give them supper and a night's lodging, if they would scare the birds from a field of corn for him till sunset. "I will go into the outlying fields," said the knave, "and as I see the birds coming, I will turn them back. You, dear friend, remain in the corn, and scare away the few that may escape me." But whilst the fool clapped and shouted till he was tired, the knave went to the other side of the hedge, and lay down for a nap. As they sat together at supper, the fool said, "Dear friend, this is laborious work. I propose that we ask the farmer to let us tend sheep instead. That is a very different affair. One lies on the hillside all day. The birds do not steal sheep, and all this shouting and clapping is saved." The knave very willingly agreed, and the next morning the two friends drove a flock of sheep onto the downs. The sheep at once began to nibble, the dog sat with his tongue out, panting, and the knave and fool lay down on their backs and covered their faces with their hats to shield them from the sun. Thus they lay till evening, when, the sun being down, they uncovered their faces, and found that the sheep had all strayed away, and the dog after them. "The only plan for us is to go separate ways in search of the flock," said the knave. "Only let us agree to meet here again." They accordingly started in opposite directions, but when the fool was fairly off, the knave returned to his place, and lay down as before. By and by the dog brought the sheep back, so that when the fool returned, the knave got the credit of having found them, for the dog scorned to explain his part in the matter. As they sat together at supper, the fool said, "The work is not so easy as I thought. Could we not find a better trade yet?" "Can you beg?" said the knave. "A beggar's trade is both easy and profitable. Nothing is required but walking and talking. Then one walks at his own pace, for there is no hurry, and no master, and the same tale does for every door. And that all may be fair and equal, you shall beg at the front door, whilst I ask alms at the back." To this the fool gladly agreed, and as he was as lean as a hunted cat, charitable people gave him a penny or two from time to time. Meanwhile the knave went round to the backyard, where he picked up a fowl or turkey, or anything that he could lay his hands upon. When he returned to the fool, he would say, "See what has been given to me, whilst you have only got a few pence?" At last this made the fool discontented, and he said, "I should like now to exchange with you. I will go to the back doors, and you go to the front." The knave consented, and at the next house the fool went to the back door. But the mistress of the farm only rated him and sent him away. Meanwhile the knave from the front had watched her leave the parlour, and slipping in through the window, he took a ham and a couple of new loaves from the table, and so made off. When the friends met, the fool was crestfallen at his ill luck, and the knave complained that all the burden of their support fell upon him. "See," said he, "what they give me, where you only get a mouthful of abuse." And he dined heartily on what he had stolen, but the fool only had bits of the bread crust and parings of the ham. At the next place, the fool went to the front door as before, and the knave secured a fat goose and some plums in the backyard, which he popped under his cloak. The fool came away with empty hands, and the knave scolded him, saying, "Do you suppose that I mean to share this fat goose with a lazy beggar like you? Go on and find for yourself." With which he sat down and began to eat the plums, whilst the fool walked on alone. After a while, however, the knave saw a stir in the direction of the farm they had left, and he quickly perceived that the loss of the goose was known, and that the farmer and his men were in pursuit of the thief. So, hastily picking up the goose, he overtook the fool and pressed it into his arms, saying, "Dear friend, pardon a passing ill humour, of which I sincerely repent. Are we not partners in good luck and ill? I was wrong, dear friend, and in token of my penitence, the goose shall be yours alone. And here are a few plums with which you may refresh yourself by the wayside. As for me, I will hasten on to the next farm, and see if I can beg a bottle of wine to wash down the dinner, and drink to our good fellowship." And before the fool could thank him, the knave was off like the wind. By and by the farmer and his men came up, and found the fool eating the plums, with the goose on the grass behind him. They hurried him off to the justice, where his own story met with no credit. The woman of the next farm came up also, and recognized him for the man who had begged at her door the day she lost a ham and 2 new loaves. In vain he said that these things also had been given to his friend. The friend never appeared, and the poor fool was whipped and put in the stocks. Towards evening the knave hurried up to the village green, where his friend sat, doing penance for the theft. "My dear friend," said he, "what do I see? Is such cruelty possible? But I hear that the justice is not above a bribe, and we must at any cost obtain your release. I am going to at once pawn my own boots and a cloak, and everything about me that I can spare, and if you have anything to add, this is no time to hesitate." The poor fool begged his friend to draw off his boots, and to take his hat and coat as well, and to make all speed on his charitable errand. The knave took all that he could get, and leaving his friend sitting in the stocks in his shirt sleeves, he disappeared as swiftly as one could wish a man to carry a reprieve. For those good folks to whom everything must be explained in full, it may be added that the knave did not come back, and that he kept the clothes. It was very hard on the fool, but what can one expect if he keeps company with a knave? End of chapter 18. Knave and Fool.
Chapter 19 of Old-Fashioned Fairy Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Keena Price. Old-Fashioned Fairy Tales by Juliana Horatia Gatty Ewing. Under the Sun. There once lived a farmer who was so avaricious and miserly, and so hard and close in all his dealings, that, as folks say, he would skin a flint. A Jew and a Yorkshireman had each tried to bargain with him, and both had had the worst of it. It is needless to say that he never either gave or lent. Now, by thus scraping and saving and grinding for many years, he had become almost wealthy, though indeed he was no better fed and dressed than if he had not a penny to bless himself with. But what vexed him sorely was that his neighbour's farm prospered in all matters better than his own, and thus although the owner was as open-handed as our farmer was stingy. When in spring he ploughed his own worn-out land and reached the top of the furrow where his field joined one of the richly fed fields of his neighbour, he would cast an envious glance over the hedge and say, "So far and no farther?" For he would have liked to have had the whole under his plough. And so in the autumn, when he gathered his own scanty crop and had to stop his sickle short of the close ranks of his neighbour's corn, he would cry, "All this and none of that?" and go home sorely discontented. Now on the lands of the liberal farmer, whose name was Merryweather, there lived a dwarf or hillman, who made a wager that he would both beg and borrow of the covetous farmer, and out-bargain him to boot, So he went one day to his house and asked him if he would kindly give him half a stone of flour to make a hasty pudding with, adding that if he would lend him a bag to carry it into the hill, this should be returned clean and in good condition. The farmer saw with half an eye that this was the dwarf from his neighbor's estate, and as he had always laid the luck of the liberal farmer to his being favored by the good people, he resolved to treat the little man with all civility. "Look you, wife," said he, "this is no time to be saving half a stone of flour, when we may make our fortunes with one stroke. I have heard my grandfather tell of a man who lent a sack of oats to one of the fairies and got it back filled with gold pieces. And as a good measure, as he gave of oats, so he got of gold," saying which the farmer took a canvas bag to the flour bin and began to fill it. Meanwhile the dwarf sat in the larder window and cried, "We've a big party for supper tonight. Give us good measure, neighbor, and you shall have anything under the sun that you like to ask for." When the farmer heard this, he was nearly out of his wits with delight, and his hands shook so that the flour spilled all out about the larder floor. "Thank you, dear sir," he said. "It is a bargain, and I agree to it. My wife hears us, and as a witness, wife, wife," he cried, running into the kitchen, "I am to have anything under the sun that I choose to ask for. I think of asking for neighbor Merryweather's estate, but this is a chance never likely to happen again, and I should like to make a wise choice, and that is not easy at a moment's notice." "You will have a week to think it over," said the dwarf, who had come in behind him. "I must be off now, so give me my flour, and come to the hill behind your house 7 days hence at midnight, and you shall have your share of the bargain." So the farmer tied up the flour sack and helped the dwarf with it onto his back, and as he did so he began, thinking how easily the bargain had been made, and casting about in his mind whether he could not get more where he had so easily got much. "And half a stone of flour is half a stone of flour," he muttered to himself, "and whatever it may do with thriftless people, it goes a long way in our house. And there's the bag, and a terrible lot spilled on the larder floor, and the string to tie it with, which doubtless he'll never think of returning, and my time, which must be counted, and nothing whatever for it all for a week to come." And the outlay so weighed upon his mind that he cleared his throat and began. "Not for 7 days, did you say, sir? You know, dear sir, or perhaps indeed you do not know, that when amongst each other we men have to wait for the settlement of an account, we expect something over and above the exact amount. Interest we call it, my dear sir." "And you want me to give you something extra for waiting a week?" asked the dwarf. "Pray, what do you expect?" "Oh, dear sir, I leave it to you," said the farmer. "Perhaps you may add some trifle in the flour bag, or not, as you think fit, but I leave it entirely to you." "I will give you something over and above what you shall choose," said the dwarf, "but as you say, I shall decide what it is to be." With which he shouldered the flour sack and went his way. For the next 7 days the farmer had no peace for thinking and planning and scheming how to get the most out of his one wish. His wife made many suggestions, to which he did not agree, but he was very careful not to quarrel with her, for, he said, "We will not be like the foolish couple who wasted 3 wishes on black puddings. Neither will I desire useless grandeur and unreasonable elevation, like the fisherman's wife. I will have a solid and substantial benefit." And so after a week of sleepless nights and anxious days, he came back to his first thought, and resolved to ask for his neighbor's estate. At last the night came. It was full moon, and the farmer looked anxiously about, fearing the dwarf might not be true to his appointment. But at midnight he appeared with the flour bag neatly folded in his hand. "You hold to the agreement," said the farmer. "Of course my wife was witness. I am to have anything under the sun that I ask for." "Ask away," said the dwarf. "I want neighbor Merryweather's estate," said the farmer. "What, all this land below here that joins onto your own?" "Every acre," said the farmer. "Farmer Merryweather's fields are under the moon at present," said the dwarf coolly, "and thus not within the terms of the agreement. You must choose again." But as the farmer could choose anything that was not then under the moon, he soon saw that he had been outwitted, and his rage knew no bounds at the trick the dwarf had played him. "Give me my bag at any rate," he screamed, "and the string, and your own extra gift that you promised, for half a loaf is better than no bread," he muttered, "and I may yet come in for a few gold pieces." "There's your bag," cried the dwarf, clapping it over the miser's head like an extinguisher. "It's clean enough for a nightcap. And there's your string," he added, tying it tightly around the farmer's throat till he was almost throttled. "And for my part, I'll give you what you deserve," saying which he gave the farmer such a hearty kick that he kicked him straight down from the top of the hill to his own back door. "If that does not satisfy you, I'll give you as much again," shouted the dwarf, and as the farmer made no reply, he went chuckling back to his hill. End of chapter 19. End of Old-Fashioned Fairy Tales by Juliana Horatia Gatty Ewing.